It's late. And I think that was my fault because I rescheduled. It is the end of July, a remarkable month, July 2020. Many, many historians will be writing about 2020 as a transitional month, as a month where everything changed. And I think in some ways your newsletter this week, Keith, reflects that. You lead with your friend, Paul Graham, another grenade of a piece which he's thrown out into the world, the 4 quadrants of conformism. Why did you lead with this, Keith, this week? What's the big deal about Graham's 4 quadrants of conformism?
Well, 2 reasons. One is I was mean about him last week when I was talking about Y Combinator, and I realized afterwards he is one of the loudest and most important voices in explaining why cancel culture might not be the smartest way to deal with things you disagree with. And this essay, which he published this week, is a very interesting take where he compares cancel culture to the end of intellectual curiosity and questioning, fear of the other, if you like, dominating interest in understanding the other. And he describes conformism as the process of everyone getting behind the established point of view and not questioning it. And his thought is that the established point of view is increasingly becoming cancel culture. So it's a longish essay. It's very thoughtful. It's well argued. And immediately for me, given my age and my education, it began to sound like the Enlightenment thinkers who made similar points about religious orthodoxy back in the day. And so I thought it was worth highlighting, putting at the top, and applauding him as well.
Couple of thoughts on this. Firstly, when you say he's one of the leading voices, you mean within Silicon Valley? Because I don't think anyone outside Silicon Valley reads Graham.
Yeah, I do mean within Silicon Valley. And even more narrowly within Twitter in Silicon Valley, which may be a smaller audience.
Yeah, I read the piece. I have to admit that I wasn't comfortable with it. I think the thing that particularly troubled me was this idea that conformism is somehow relative. So I think the most controversial piece is he argues that today the conformist position, as you say, is to be very open-minded and perhaps aggressively open-minded about race. But the same people today who are in favor of quote-unquote cancel culture, which I'm not sure is a concept I actually even believe in exists. I think it's a construction of people like Graham. But the idea that the equivalent of the aggressive students in the cancel culture movement in 2020 would have been people in favor of slavery in the middle of the 19th century. Is that a fair observation? I mean, you may not agree with what I'm saying. That's what he's arguing, right?
I don't think he's that crude. I think it is important, and you're really making this point, to trace the origins of what is called, fairly or unfairly, cancel culture. And I think the origins go back to when you and me were in university. I was part of something called counterculture. And counterculture was, we organized an alternative curriculum at our university and encouraged students to attend our unofficial lectures as opposed to the official lectures. And shortly after counterculture, became the emergence of women's rights, gay rights. We're all part of that. And that evolved into something you could think of today as identity politics. Now, identity politics is the championing of difference, which of course is a good thing. And the hostility to racism, sexism, homophobia, which are also good things. So at the core of what is called cancel culture are people who desire everybody to be equal and treated fairly. So in that sense, the spirit behind it is to be championed. What's happened is, as identity politics has grown stronger, it's trying to, it has tended to want to use its power to close down its opponents as opposed to debate with them. And that in a sense is taking the oppressed, taking on the mantle of the oppressor, crossing the line, if you like, from the powerless to the powerful. And all Paul Graham's really saying is that's not smart, because the oppressed are going to be the victims of any societal attempt to close ideas down. And so to adopt those methods is self-defeating. And I think that's a fair point, Andrew.
Well, but let us come back to, I mean, you're saying that Graham didn't say anything quite as crude. He did. He said, I'm quoting him in the piece. He quotes this Princeton professor, Robert George, who's also extremely controversial. And then Graham says, he's too polite to say so. He's talking about George, but of course they wouldn't. And indeed, our default assumption should not merely be that his students would, on average, have behaved the same way people did at the time, i.e., with slavery. And George is talking about his contemporary students now at Princeton. On average, have behaved the same way people did at the time, but that the ones who are aggressively conventionally minded today would have been aggressively conventional minded then too. In other words, and he says it clearly, this is your friend, Paul Graham. In other words, that they'd have not only fought against slavery, but that they would have been amongst its staunchest defenders. So what he's saying is that today's so-called council culture, these people who are aggressively, particularly at elite universities like Princeton, aggressively in favor of identitarian politics and close people down, who are in any way suspect, would have indeed been supporters of slavery, which to me is a pretty outrageous thing to say. I mean, you don't believe that, right?
No, I don't believe that.
So he is saying it. I mean, there's no two ways about it. You can't defend him here.
You got to remember the newsletter, by the way, is a long piece from Roger McNamee, who I agree strongly.
Now you're changing the subject, Keith. Let's focus on what's his name?
I just want to make the point that when I put something in the newsletter,
no, I'm not blaming you. It
doesn't mean I agree with it. So
So my point. Look, I'm all in favor of you quoting Graham. It's absolutely great. I'm hopefully an open-minded person myself. I'm not in favor of shutting Graham down. But what I am saying is that that's exactly what he's saying. And it may be even more reason for you to make this a piece of the week, because it's exactly this kind of argument which outrages the kids at Princeton and will actually call for the cancelling of people like Graham.
I think he's trying to stir up those people with rhetorical flourishes that are not the primary point. There is something really good in this essay, and what's really
go on.
What's really good in it is the call for open debate and confrontation, and not being scared of being offended. To the point where you don't want to hear the other side's argument. That's really at the core of it. Now, some of his rhetorical flourishes, as you're quoting, take the point to a silly place. But that's
an offensive place, I think, for some people.
And that's often the case with polemic. I mean, he's being polemical, and I think, I don't want to be polemical, but I do want to say that it is increasingly the conformist point of view to close down, especially right-wing opinion that smells of racism or sexism or homophobia, not to argue with it, but to close it down. And I don't think that's good. And I agree with him that it would be better.
And we all agree. And we certainly, we're not closing anything down on our show. That was the week, Keith. Just very briefly on the 4 quadrants of conformism, where do you situate yourself and myself? So we can have upper left going counterclockwise, aggressively conventionally minded, passively conventionally minded, passively independently minded, and aggressively independently minded. Where are you and where am I?
I'm definitely aggressively independently minded, and I'd say if there's anything to the top left of me, you're there.
You mean I'm even more aggressively independently minded than you?
Yeah, you are. Look at your publishing history and the issues you've taken
And what
on.
about Paul Graham? He's in that same place.
He's definitely in that place.
And Mike Arrington and the rest of us.
Yeah, I think, isn't it called A-type personalities?
No, well, I hope so. Anyway, let's move on. I don't want to, it's everyone should read it. I mean, as you say, I think it's fair to say Paul is a smart guy, and he's a brave guy in his own way. He's willing to put his opinions out there. I think a lot of people would agree with him, but they're not quite as willing to stick their neck over the parapet. And the other piece which connects with this in your reads of the week is cancelling the opinions of those you don't agree with is a slippery slope. Here's a better option by Robert Glazer, an entrepreneur. So what's Glazer saying that's interesting that perhaps adds to the Graham piece, Keith?
So firstly, let's just remember who Rob Glazer is. He was the founder of Real Networks,
right?
Which was what we're doing today, streaming.
Keith, no, you got that one wrong.
Oh, it's a different Rob Glazer.
So, do you want to start this?
No, we can acknowledge.
We can edit this out.
We can acknowledge that I called.
Well, if it is it's because Rob Glazer calls himself Rob Glazer. I actually follow him on Twitter, and he's a really smart, quick-speaking guy. But Robert Glazer is a contributor, and he's a much younger man, white male. So I think Robert Glazer and Rob Glazer are two quite different characters.
For what it's worth, I would have put this in no matter which Robert Glazer it
so
was.
Don't be offended, Robert Glazer. You're even more important in Keith's mind than Rob Glazer. So what's Robert Glazer saying, Keith, that's interesting?
He's basically, if you read the bold headlines that are at the top of his paragraphs or his sections, invite dissent, embrace dissonance, don't waste your energy. And he's basically saying that ideas are a marketplace. We all operate in that marketplace. And the end result of that marketplace is the world we live in. And so you absolutely don't want to restrict the marketplace to only one set of products. Otherwise, you don't get the human race doesn't get invested in the next phase of its own life if you do that. So he's pretty consistent with Paul Graham in his point of view. Now, in doing that, he does acknowledge we all have core values, and they're non-negotiable, and they're different. So it is that non-negotiable core value difference that makes up the human race. And by the way, any software platform we all live on. So he's basically asking us all to relax and recognize ourselves collectively in what exists, which is interesting in the light of everything that happened in Congress this week with the 4 CEOs being called up.
Right, and Silicon Valley increasingly being under fire on lots of different fronts. Maybe that's something we talked about that before, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again in the future. Your tweet of the week, though, was a little bit more cheerful, and it reflects the fact that Silicon Valley is doing. It's always easy to pile in on Silicon Valley and claim everything it's doing is sexist and racist and unfair. But your tweet of the week reflects at least one good piece of news. It's from Mac, the VC, who says, I just got a full scholarship for VC University Online presented by Startup at Berkeley Law, the National Venture Capital Association, and Venture Forward. I'm about to have VC training certificate from both Stanford and Berkeley. 2020 is about to be my breakout year. Hashtag VC, hashtag startup. Why is that your tweet of the week, Keith?
So the first thing is I actually had a Zoom call with Mac about 3 weeks ago, which was one of maybe 1,000 Zoom calls he's been doing. And what I learned is that he was venture investing on behalf of part of the city, I think, in Philadelphia, doing seed rounds in Philadelphia. He's African American. He's He's spent the last month going from a very small number of Twitter followers to 10,000 as of a few days ago. And he's been on a mission to transform himself from a guy working for the city to an independent investor. And his tweet streams have been incredibly insightful. And now he announces that people have noticed, and he's got this scholarship. He's a young guy, by the way.
I'm just about to follow him, by the way, on Twitter. You've convinced me.
And I just thought, what a fantastic piece of evidence that effort that you put in to progress for yourself pays off if you're consistent, work hard, smart. He's just a great example to any entrepreneur who has a goal, how to pursue it. And it just felt really good to see that.
Well, that's great news. And we haven't given up yet on Silicon Valley or on America, for that matter. Finally, Keith, you serve up a really, and I use this word carefully, chunky piece by Chunkamui. 6 laws of zero will shape our future. For the better or worse, it's up to us. What are these 6 laws of zero? And I wonder whether we might include a 7th, which is opinion. But what are the 6 laws?
Well, the 6 laws refers to something that a very well-known guy called Alan Kay was involved in over a long period of time. But it's basically to do with automation leading to key elements of human existence being free. And it isn't so much 6 laws as 6 things which will become free. The first is computing, which is subject to Moore's law. The second is communications. We're doing what we're doing now more or less for free. Information becomes free. Energy becomes free as we move to wind and sun and so on. Water becomes free, and transportation becomes free. Now, if all of that is true with automation and innovation, that means life becomes free, largely. And things like universal basic income and joblessness.
It's what Albert Wenger, our friend, calls life after capital.
Exactly right. So now if you put together Chunkamui's piece about the economics of life tending towards free, with Paul Graham and others stuff about acceptance of difference, open discourse, disagreement, being relaxed with being offended, those 2 things are exactly what the Enlightenment was founded on before industrialization. The core of it was innovation and a move away from religion, believing in human beings, and society getting better and better and better through progress. Saint-Simon, and the architects of democracy, all came about in an era where those were the key tenets. And it feels as if they still need to be, which is why I put them together, and I called the newsletter this week Enlightenment Anybody? ?
Yeah, and this is a longer conversation as well, Keith, and you bring me on to be obnoxious, so I'm going to be really obnoxious. I mean, this is kind of absurd. It's like Silicon Valley's fairy tales. The idea that 6 drivers of human progress: water, transportation, energy. We're on the verge of an environmental apocalypse. Haven't you read about that? I mean, okay, it's debatable whether it's an apocalypse or just terrible global warming, but this notion that all this stuff is free, we've heard this crap before. We heard it about computing, and look what happened. Now we have trillion-dollar computing companies. There's nothing free about that. We heard it with surveillance capitalism, and we're all paying for this stuff with our data. So I just don't buy this. It's just stupid.
Well, it isn't stupid, but I accept that you don't buy it. It is And you're not stupid either, because
yeah, maybe I'm saying stupid is unfair. It's just ridiculously optimistic.
Well, I think it's important when you're talking about the long term, and he's talking about 2050. It's important to understand direction and probabilism. Now, he, by the way, is a great believer in solving environmental disaster through sustainable energy is a big part of it.
But so water, but I mean, just use one of these. I mean, we're on the verge of water wars. Where's, however, no brilliant technologist is going to invent solutions to the scarcity of water, especially with global warming. When's water going to be?
Well, his point is that by 2050, and he's talking about 2050, and I'll read the quote: anyone near a body of salt water can benefit from water technology breakthroughs. And he makes the point that desalination, which has always been a promise, is now getting to be real, in the same way that, I've got solar energy on my roof now, and for the last 8 months, I haven't paid anything for electricity. Now, it did cost me $25,000 to get to that starting point, but does anyone believe that by 2050, those solar panels won't be close to free? They probably will be. So I think he's not crazy. He is very much thinking, long term, 30 years. And that's the same time period that joblessness will grow to billions. So it's an important conversation.
Right. And it's Albert's argument about a world after capital, which drives him to argue, to be close to Andy Yang and argue in favor of guaranteed minimum income and all the rest of it. So the one area, I mean, okay, I accept I maybe overreacted a little bit, but we've heard this argument about computing being free, and I just don't buy, excusing the pun, I don't buy it. I mean, computing is, in some senses, relatively free. You and I are doing this for free, but someone's getting very rich out of it, whether it's our providers, or whether it's Google or Twitter or YouTube or wherever else we're broadcasting this. The idea of free, I think, is a delusion.
Well, I think let's separate who gets rich from what it costs, because I think you're right that people are getting rich, and I think that's a separate conversation about ownership. What is ownership? 50 years from now, when there is automation, and you and I probably align a lot around the problem of discussing that. But at the point of view of what you spend, Apple this week announced that if you have an Apple card, you can get an iPhone now on a monthly plan, which was about $50 a month, I think.
Yeah.
So the trend is that the relationship between cost and computing power are moving in the direction of each unit of computing power getting closer and closer to zero, and massive power being put in the hands of people. And that's real, and that's true. So the trend towards free doesn't mean no one makes money, because Apple owns the iPhone and you buy it from them. But it does mean for you and me, we can do things that CNN only could do.
Now TV.
Exactly. And so the cost of entry into very profound technologies is getting close to free. And my newsletter, I don't get paid for doing it.
Well, you're trying to be paid, aren't you? Charging as well?
I give it away for free for the most part. You can choose to pay me as an act of good faith if you want to, but you don't have to.
Well, here's how I said we got to go now, Keith. But here's my suggestion: is that we this show will certainly run and run and run, and in 2050, we will, in July of 2050. We will have a show about whether or not computing, communications, information, energy, water, and transportation have all become free. And I will bet my Diet Coke, my empty can of Diet Coke today, that it won't be free.
That's known as a long bet. And the sad news is that in 2050, I will be 96 years old, and therefore probably not around to collect my.
Well, he didn't say life. Actually, he didn't. What he didn't do was sort of add the Tealian little seduction that we'll all live forever too. So maybe that will be the 7th key driver. But anyway, I hope we'll still be alive next week, Keith. For This Was the Week. Thank you for a wonderful conversation and some really stimulating, provocative links and tweets, as you always do.
Thank you, Andrew. See you next week.